I'm a freak of nature. Strength, wildly average. Physique, probably lifts, but I wasn't always this way. Here's the power building program I'm using to keep getting more jacked and stronger. We're back. Milo Wolf here, soon to be Dr. Milo Wolf, coming at you from Wolf Coaching. Today, we're breaking down my power building program, why it's designed the way it is, and how you could use inspiration from it to build your own power building program. If you want to learn about the science behind power building, check out this video here. Otherwise, if you want free programs that include power building, lengthened partials, and all sorts of other good stuff, check out the newsletter below. If you subscribe, I will send you 15 free programs, including power building programs. With that being said, here's my program. I have historically grown better when training muscle groups a little bit more frequently. Additionally, my bench really benefits from higher frequencies, up to 4 or 5 times a week, including variations like the close grip bench or incline pressing. I train 6 days a week. 4 of those days are full body days, and 2 of those days are upper body only days. In order to keep fatigue of the spine or spinal erectors in check, I only have 3 of those full body days include any sort of squatting or deadlifting variation. On day 1, I start with my competition deadlift, sumo, followed by my accessory squat, high bar squatting. On both of these exercises, I keep about 5 repetitions in reserve, as going closer to failure doesn't improve strength gains. Additionally, going close to failure would cause a lot more fatigue. I also keep repetitions at about 5%, as I still want to get a good deal of hypertrophy even from these powerlifting or strength-specific exercises. I don't usually do more than 2 or 3 sets of these main lifts, as doing more of that wouldn't really help out my strength by that much, but it would take away from the hypertrophy training I'm able to do, and that's a bigger priority to me right now. After these 2 exercises, which can take quite a bit of time, I follow it up with some arm and shoulder work. All of this is supersetted so as to save time. You can check out a video about this here. But essentially, I'm doing 4 exercises. 1 for my biceps, 1 for my triceps, these are supersetted, and then 1 for my side and rear delts, and 1 for my forearms. Again, these 2 are supersetted. The general structure of compounds for lower body, followed by upper body accessories or isolation work, or upper body compounds followed by lower body isolation work, is the general structure I follow in order to take a full body approach. If I do lower body days, personally, I find that by the time I get to like exercise number 2, 3, 4, my energy is minimal. So I prefer spreading out my lower body work across the week as well, in terms of allowing for sufficient volume load accumulation across the session, which is likely important for growth. Across the week, you'll notice that a variety of rep ranges are used. For the most part, I'll be training between 5 and 20 reps, but occasionally there may be some higher rep work in there as well. So for biceps, I do the easy bar preacher curl. The easy bar preacher curl doesn't lengthen the elbow flexors all that much because your shoulder is slightly flexed, but the most resistance in the preacher curl is relatively close to the bottom position. And in fact, to emphasize that, I use lengthened partials. I superset these preacher curls with dumbbell overhead extensions. By using an overhead extension, we're able to lengthen the long head of the triceps more and get more hypertrophy that way. I also use dumbbell overhead extensions as opposed to easy bar extensions or barbell extensions because I can safely go close to failure on these. In fact, I will generally aim to go about 2 reps in reserve on the first set of an exercise, all the way to failure on the last set of an exercise when I'm performing this for hypertrophy. After the curl and overhead extension superset, I then move on to machine lateral raises and dumbbell wrist curls. The reason I'm doing machine lateral raises is A, because it's pretty low fatigue, I don't need to stabilize anything as opposed to a standing dumbbell lateral raise, and B, because I don't have to hold on to anything. So even though I'm supersetting the wrist curl, which uses my forearms, and the lateral raise, there is no overlapping fatigue. On both the machine lateral raise and the dumbbell wrist curl, I will do lengthened partials, only going about halfway up relative to how high I can go. Generally, across a training block, I may add a set or 2 here or there to these isolation exercises or any exercise that I'm doing predominantly for hypertrophy if recovery allows. If I'm still super sore and my performance is struggling, I will generally keep volume the same until I'm adapted to it. So that's session number 1. By pairing the heavier compound lifting for the lower body with some pretty quick upper body isolation work, the session overall doesn't take too long. The second day is essentially the opposite. I first start with some compound work for my upper body, which I didn't do on day 1, and follow it up with isolation work for the lower body. The key thing here is that this isolation work doesn't really target my lower back very much. And so between days 1 and day 4, I am able to have my lower back recover pretty well from the deadlifts and from the high bar squat. This in turn allows me to lift more on day 4 when I'm doing my lower body lifting again, and hopefully that should lead to more strength adaptations. So on day 2, I'm doing some bench. My main benching variation is actually the close grip bench press. It's just what I find most comfortable and what I want to get stronger at. So for my first 2 exercises, I superset the close grip bench with a dumbbell row. On the close grip bench, I stay relatively far from failure because my aim with that exercise is to build strength. With the dumbbell row, I will go close to failure. Again, about 2 reps in reserve on the first set to about failure on the last set. You'll notice that across the week, I don't really go below 5 reps. This is because I mostly care about hypertrophy and I don't really care about my 1 rep max right now. If I were to try and max out in a few months' time, I would gradually shift my training to being lower reps, especially on those main lifts like the close grip bench, like the high bar squat and the sumo deadlift. For essentially all hypertrophy exercises across the week, I'm doing lengthened partials. Lengthened partials seem to be a pretty good tool for gaining additional muscle mass, so that's why I'm doing them. Following the bench and row superset, I then do overhead press as a lighter variation. For overhead pressing, I do somewhat care about getting it stronger, but I also care about growing bigger shoulders. And in fact, I think the overhead press is a slightly underrated exercise for the side delts. While I do want to get stronger at it, and I'm performing it twice a week actually, I am also getting quite close to failure, with the last set always being taken to volitional failure, just like any other hypertrophy exercise. This is the lighter overhead press day, and I have a heavier overhead press day at the end of the week, where the overhead press is performed first to maximize loading, which would probably lead to more strength adaptations. Following the overhead press, I then have my lower body isolation work. Specifically, I do reverse Nordic curls to target the quadriceps in a lengthened position, superset with seated leg curls, which again target the hamstrings in a very lengthened position by flexing the hip to a greater extent compared to a lying leg curl. And there's actually been one study looking at this where the hamstrings grew more as a result of doing seated leg curls rather than lying leg curls, due to the greater muscle length being achieved. I then follow this up with a superset of hip abduction and hip adduction training. Certain muscles, like the rectus femoris, that's both a hip flexor and a knee extensor, or the bicep femoris short head, the short head of the hamstrings, or the glute medius and minimus, or the adductor longus and brevis. These muscles don't really get trained very well at all during compound exercises for the lower body, like the high bar squat, like the sumo deadlift, and so training them at least once a week gives you some pretty good hypertrophy for not much additional work. So I make it a point in hypertrophy training for people who really want to take their lower body size up to include at least once a week or maybe twice a week isolation work for these muscles that otherwise don't get trained very well during compound exercises. That's day 2. Again, by supersetting a lot of exercises and by only having compounds for one part of the body, i.e. the upper body or the lower body, this allows me to get the sessions in generally within an hour and a half or so. Next, on day 3, this is mostly a hypertrophy day. I do use it to sneak in an additional bench day across the week, but this is mostly done for hypertrophy purposes. My 3 other bench days across the week involve flat pressing, and I want to include at least one incline pressing variation so my upper chest doesn't completely vanish. Since most of my benching work across the week is pretty heavy and doing a variety of rep ranges across the week is better for hypertrophy, I make sure to do around 10 reps on this session on the incline bench press exercise. Since I'm training a bit farther from failure on the other bench days, I train a bit closer to failure on the incline press day. Specifically, I go all the way to volitional failure on every single set. So I superset the 45-degree incline close grip bench press. The close grip is used to accentuate range of motion a little bit in the lengthened position. I use this exercise and superset it with a pull down. Following this incline bench and pull down superset, I follow it up with an incline dumbbell curl and skull crusher superset. You'll notice that both of these exercises require the same equipment, namely a bench and some dumbbells. When constructing supersets, a very undervalued aspect is whether or not it's practically feasible. By using the same equipment for both exercises, you can ensure that even in a busy gym, you're able to do this and get your session done in a reasonable time frame. On this day, this is my lighter work for my arms and delts. As I mentioned, a variety of rep ranges across the week is better for hypertrophy. So in this case, I'm doing sets of 20 to 30 reps. With a full range of motion, the incline curl is not a great exercise. When you're doing lengthened partials on the incline curl, it may actually become a pretty effective exercise because now you're taking a part of the range of motion that is otherwise quite easy, there's not much tension, and you're loading it sufficiently heavily to hopefully make that lengthened position a lot more challenging and a lot more stimulating. After this incline curl and skull crusher superset, I then move on to rear delt crossovers. I think this is a really undervalued exercise for the rear delts because you actually get a deep stretch in rear delts, which you wouldn't really get on most other shoulder exercises. You don't really get it in a bilateral face pull, but in a rear delt crossover, which is essentially the opposite motion of a chest crossover, you can get a deep stretch, which will likely lead to more hypertrophy. I also make sure to take 2 steps forward to slightly increase the resistance in the bottom position, in that stretch position. Finally, I end the session with a ab and calf superset. Those 2 exercises don't have any overlap, they're not super systemically fatiguing, I don't get out of breath, so I can superset them safely without influencing or impacting performance in any detrimental way to muscle growth. And also, it kind of makes ab and calf training a little bit more enjoyable and engaging. which, let's be honest, it usually isn't. I choose the rope cable crunch because it's a really easy exercise that doesn't cause a lot of fatigue, where you can really focus on extending your spine and flexing your spine as opposed to your hips. I also use the single leg press calf raise because it's the most convenient way I have of training my calves. I don't need to find any dumbbells or kettlebells to do standing calf raises. I can just sit down, there's no spinal loading involved really, and do my calf raises. I do them single leg because the machine isn't heavy enough for me to do both legs at the same time in a heavy rep range. Personally, I found that calf training above about 12 reps seems to really burn the bottom of my feet, and so I typically avoid anything above 12 reps for my calves and go pretty heavy. Again, I perform lengthened partials on my calf raises. There's actually been one study looking at lengthened partials versus shortened partials versus a full range of motion in the calves directly, and yeah, lengthened partials led to more growth. Day 4. This is my second relatively heavy lower body day for the week. In this session, I start with my main squat variation, which is the low bar squat, and follow it with my deadlift accessory, which is the RDL. Same set, rep and reserve scheme as for sumo deadlifts and high bar squats early in the week, sets of 5 with about 5 reps in the tank. For the RDL specifically, I do lengthened partials and I use a deficit RDL. This is gonna really target your hamstrings, glutes, and adductors at long muscle lengths, which is actually one study now showing greater hypertrophy when doing lengthened partials versus full range of motion in the hamstrings and in the glutes. Again, because earlier in the week on the sumo deadlift, my other hip extensor work, I trained pretty far from failure, pretty submaximally. I make sure to go pretty close to failure on these RDLs. Generally, on the last set, I'll actually aim for momentary failure where I try a rep and it doesn't go all the way up and I just fail. After low bar squats and RDLs, I will follow that up with more upper body isolation work for my arms and shoulders. Again, by doing this, I'm able to get in and out the gym in about an hour and a half as opposed to like a 3-hour session, which some powerlifters wind up having to do. After the RDL, I superset a cable curl with a bench, with a cable set up behind me to get a deep stretch, with a cable overhead extension. The cable curl with a bench and with a cable set up behind you at about hand height at the bottom of each rep accomplishes a few things. 1, it's a very stable, low fatigue exercise due to just being sat down. 2, by having the arm come behind you at the bottom of every rep, you're able to get a deeper stretch on the long head of your biceps, similarly to an incline curl. Number 3, by having the cable set up at hand height at the bottom of each rep, there is a great deal of resistance at the bottom in that lengthened stretch position compared to something like an incline curl. The overhead extension, well, it's just good exercise for hypertrophy, as I mentioned earlier, because by having the arm up overhead and the shoulder quite flexed, it lengthens the long head to a greater extent compared to, say, a push down. Also, again, the same equipment is involved. Cable is needed in both cases. A bench is also needed, but by having the cable in both cases, you can just stay in the same place and do this exercise back to back. Then I move on to yet another superset, this time targeting, again, my side delts and my forearms. Again, these two exercises require similar equipment. Now you might think, wait a minute, Milo, doesn't the dumbbell wrist curl fatigue your forearms, which then interferes with cable ladder raises? Well, you might be right. However, what you can do is you can use straps on the cable ladder raise to essentially take your grip out of the equation. So while you do have some forearm fatigue when supersetting wrist curls with cable ladder raises, by using straps, you're able to make the superset quite effective and not really impact the performance on either exercise. Moving on from day 4, we go into day 5, where I start the session by supersetting a medium grip bench press, that's my third bench variation for the week, with a T-bar row. There's not really a super strong rationale behind the medium grip bench press. It's just another bench variation that's reasonably specific to my main bench, which is close grip, and I'm gradually trying to get better at wider grip benching. Historically, I've always sucked at wider grip benching, so I'm trying to get better at it by incorporating some medium grip bench press and gradually widening that grip. The T-bar row does a pretty good job of providing some tension in a length position, and by design, you cannot get super short muscle lengths on the T-bar row. So it becomes a pretty good exercise as far as the length in the work is concerned. Then I move on to a dumbbell fly and dumbbell pullover superset. This session does target the chest and back specifically pretty heavily. You'll have noticed that throughout the week, I only ever do one exercise for chest and or back within a given session. This is the exception. The dumbbell fly is a great exercise for the chest, provided you can handle it in terms of pain, because it targets the chest most heavily in the lengthened position. It is very challenging in that bottom position, and as you get the dumbbell up and up into the shortened position for your chest, it becomes easier and easier. The same goes for the dumbbell pullover. For a long time, I thought, well, we don't really want to use a dumbbell pullover because it's a partial range of motion, and that's worse. Well, actually, given the recent research on lengthened partials and how important that is for hypertrophy, it's actually become the opposite, where the dumbbell pullover challenges your lats and teres major most strongly in that very lengthened position, and that will likely lead to more growth overall. Again, I'm doing the dumbbell fly and dumbbell pullover for higher reps because I want to make sure that across the week, I'm getting a variety of rep ranges in for each muscle group to maximize hypertrophy, as some recent analyses have shown that this leads to more hypertrophy. Finally, I end the session with yet another ab and calf superset. As bodybuilders, we kind of have to train our calves, well, unless you're blessed, and our abs, again, unless you're blessed. But I kind of have to, and supersetting it makes it more time efficient, less boring, more engaging, and doesn't really take away from my results. In fact, it kind of makes sure I rest long enough between sets, because if I do it on its own, I will literally just rush through the sets to get done, because calf and ab training is potentially the most boring thing ever. So just to touch on the decline crunch, I think the decline crunch, when performed properly, as shown on screen now, can be an extremely effective exercise, and performed properly, I cannot do more than about 12 reps. So you don't even need additional weight. It's just a great exercise. The reason it's great is because in the bottom position, around parallel to the ground, is where you have the most resistance, and that is also the lengthened position. So when you're performing it properly, the decline crunch is both very challenging and very good for hypertrophy. Finally, day 6. Day 6 is a bit odd. First, I start with a barbell overhead press. As I mentioned, I want to get stronger at the overhead press, but I'm also doing it for hypertrophy, so I'm actually going all the way to volitional failure on that last set. Similar to close grip benching earlier in the week, and to sumo deadlifts and to low bar squats, I'm doing it for sets of 5 because I still want a good hypertrophy stimulus from it. Similarly to the other power lifts, like the sumo deadlift, the bench, the low bar squat earlier in the week, I'm doing sets of 5 repetitions because I do still want a good hypertrophy effect from that set. After overhead pressing, I superset a soft touch close grip bench press for high reps with a machine row for high reps as well. This is a pretty close variation of my main bench. The only real difference is I'm performing it for higher reps and with a soft touch as opposed to a deep sink into my chest as I usually do. It's just to get more practice at benching with a relatively similar variation. In this case, because I am doing it for hypertrophy, and because the soft touch is more conducive to hypertrophy as a result of producing more tension to control the bar at the bottom position, compared to a deep sink where you're just letting the bar rest essentially, it's more conducive to hypertrophy, so I make sure to also do more reps, around 10 per set, and go a bit closer to failure. I actually go to pretty much volitional failure on all sets for this exercise. And then I superset the close grip bench with a row variation. You'll notice that across the week, there's a pretty even split between how many of my back exercises are rowing variations and how many of them are pull down or vertical pulling variations. This is because different muscles are involved when you're doing, say, a vertical pull versus a row. So you want to make sure there's a roughly even split of them across the week within a given training program. Following this, I do Bulgarian split squats on the Smith machine. Why do I do this? There's a few reasons. First, I use the Smith machine because it's very stable. I can go to failure and not have to worry about getting thrown off balance and failing the set due to that. I can actually fail the set when my quads, adductors, and glutes are unable to produce enough force anymore. Secondly, it's pretty safe. I can just re-rack the weight anytime and it's cool. Third, a single leg variation, like a split squat, allows me to get more volume in pretty close to failure without really fatiguing my lower back for a deadlift session that's happening 2 days later. Finally, it does provide some squatting-ish variation to hopefully get a bit more practice in with the general movement of squatting. I follow this up with 3 pretty controversial exercises. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, these last 3 exercises, I kind of skip half the time. First, I do some back extensions. I'm doing back extensions because there's some research that actually doing some lower back training directly can help people with non-specific chronic lower back pain. So if you're someone who has back pain, obviously consult your physician. I'm not giving you any medical advice here, but just be aware, there's some research that may help. Additionally, it may or may not help me with my squat and deadlift, but that's a topic for another video. And then I follow it up with a superset of neck curls and neck extensions. These 2 exercises I purely do because I think a bigger neck looks kind of cool. I haven't actually done any neck training in years, like 5 years. So I figure, hey, if I can do this once a week and get some additional size, that's cool. And I'm not at any risk for obstructive sleep apnea, so I don't have to worry about that. So I figure, why not do it? As a fun aside, I actually did get tested for sleep apnea maybe like 3 years ago, and I had an extremely low score, so I don't have anything to worry about, and that's why I'm really not concerned at all about sleep apnea being a thing. Anyways, that's the program. To recap, this is a power building program. For the most part, I am focused on hypertrophy, but I do incorporate some relatively heavier sets on the main lifts just to get a little bit stronger at them over time. And at some point, I might decide, hey, let me switch up my training a little bit, go a bit heavier on those main lifts, cut out some of the fluff work, and max out on the main lifts, and see where I'm at. This is my training split, so it may not work great for you. However, it's heavily inspired by the 15 free programs I'm giving away in the description as a newsletter. If you sign up to this newsletter, you'll get 15 free programs that'll do all the thinking for you, give you a very effective program incorporating length and partials and all the training science described in this video here. Anyways, that's the video. If you liked the video, please comment, like, subscribe. If you want to see more personal style videos like this one about my training, my nutrition, my day-to-day, I can even review a technique or review some memes. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in that next one. Peace. You can't escape, Yankee. Nope, you can escape. I was joking. I'm sorry. You can go. Please don't attack me. Goodbye, kitty. Skirt.